it's a story that needs to be told,
Mm-hmm.
and that many of us here in New England haven't really heard.
Mm-hmm.
It's something, one of the things I do is give walking tours of Concord, and uh, it's not uncommon for visitors from other parts of the country to assume that because we're in the north there was never slavery
Yeah.
here, and sometimes they're shocked to find
Mm-hmm.
out there was.
Yeah, I did a classroom visit earlier this week at 6 a.m. of course, because they were it was a morning class on the East Coast. But at Northeastern, and before I logged in, the professor had done a poll about, okay, for these students, do they know slavery in New England? It was interesting to see. It was actually about 50-50. Some students actually did know about it. So I think that's starting to change a bit, as this sort of materials is getting into school curriculums, and there's college courses that are talking about it and things like that. So that's finally starting to shift a little bit, I think.
No, I think that this is a part of our history that hasn't been addressed, and recent events are making
Mm-hmm.
people realize the importance of addressing it.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are at 46 signed in, it looks like, and so I will start by introducing myself briefly to those of you who are on board. I'm Victor Curran, and on behalf of the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord, I am delighted to welcome you this afternoon. The Transcendentalism Council is a group at First Parish that presents programs to educate about and celebrate the visionary women and men of Concord, many of them connected to First Parish, though not all of them, whose ideas and actions helped to revolutionize America. And we are honored to partner with the Concord Festival of Authors to present Jared Hardesty. Concord is proud of our literary heritage, but as someone wrote recently, if you only learn about the things you're proud of, you're not really learning history. Dr. Hardesty's book, Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, takes a look at a part of New England's history that isn't easy to talk about. But now more than ever, it's vital that we talk about it. Dr. Hardesty is Associate Professor of History at Western Washington University and a scholar of colonial America, the Atlantic world, and the histories of labor and slavery. His current research project, which I'm fascinated with, examines the murder of an 18th century slave trader, smuggler, and chocolatier, and is entitled Mutiny on the Rising Sun, a tale of smuggling, murder, and chocolate in early America. I can't wait for the movie. There will be a Q&A. You participants will be muted, but if you have a question, please type it in the chat so that we can see it at the end of Dr. Hardesty's talk. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jared Hardesty.
Thank you, Victor, and thank you all for attending. Thank you to the Transcendentalism Council of First Parish in Concord and the Concord Festival of Authors for letting me speak. It is actually morning for me because it's still 11 a.m. I'm on the West Coast. And the one silver lining of this whole mess is that I actually get to participate in events like this. Otherwise, it'd require me to fly across the continent and and visit and all that. So I can actually attend events like this. So it's a really nice thing. And so thank you all for attending on your Saturday afternoons to hear me talk about my book, Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, A History of Slavery in New England. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to paste a link to the book in the chat, and I'll do that again when I'm done with my talk for anyone who's interested in purchasing it. And also at the end of my talk, I'll paste the link for my first book, Unfreedom, which is about slavery in 18th century Boston. And so this one's kind of an expansion on that. I'll talk about that in a minute. But so thank you so much for having me and for listening to me talk today. My book, Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, is the first general overview of slavery in New England written in nearly 80 years. The last book that does what my book does is Lorenzo Johnston Green's, and the title of that is The Negro in Colonial New England, published in 1942. Now, of course, since 1942, there have been plenty of books that explore slavery in New England. But usually those books are part of a larger history of slavery in the United States, slavery in the American North, or a super focused historical study. So mine is a general overview that looks at all parts of New England. And so it is the first kind of comprehensive history that's been published since 1942. And so this afternoon or morning, I guess, depending on where you are, I want to discuss the purpose of writing this book, or in other words, why I think we need this book in this moment, and then give you a brief overview of its contents. In doing so, I'll also kind of tell you a bit more about the history of slavery in New England, and we'll get much more into that in the kind of Q&A, I assume. So why did I write this book? In the end, I kind of envision this book as a conversation, more so, and me kind of narrating a conversation. That's been going on for about the past generation, about 25 years or so. And there's kind of four main parties to this conversation. The first is academics, people like me. There has been a massive outpouring of scholarship, books, journal articles, things like that, on New England slavery in the past about 25, like I said, about 25 years. Much of that scholarship, and I'm totally guilty here with my first book, has been hyper specialized, focusing on particular places, moments, themes, sets of sources, etc. These works, as excellent as they are, and many of them are very good, sometimes make it difficult to see the bigger picture. It's not very comprehensive. It looks like my first book looks at Boston only, for example. But also, there's the problems of academic publishing, things like paywalls to get access to journal articles and books and things like that. So it's not the most accessible either. Academic books are very expensive. So as scholars are having this kind of conversation largely amongst themselves, with a few public engagements here and there, a few consultings with, consultations with museums and whatnot, there's been other conversations. One of the most important, and so my second conversation I'm talking about that's been going on among libraries, archives, and historical societies across New England, who have identified collections they own that relate to slavery, and have made those accessible in a couple of ways. They've published them both in print and online, but they've also in the late 90s, especially this was common, they digitized their catalogs. And as part of that process of digitizing library catalogs and archival catalogs, they put in search terms and subject headings related to slavery, making it much easier to find and locate these sources, and thus making it easier to research the topic as a whole. And so libraries and archives have been part of this vital part of this conversation. But we add to that another conversation, and that's going on with a reckoning with slavery by leading institutions across New England. Started in the early 2000s with Brown University, and they issued their report on slavery and justice, detailing the university's connections with slavery and slave trading. But now that reckoning has extended in the past 2 decades, has extended to historic sites, large and small, to other universities, and even local and state governments are all starting to think about and explore and research their own connections to slavery, sometimes haphazardly, sometimes cautiously, but it is certainly happening. So, in the final piece of this conversation, and the one that's really important, is the work of community activists, of public historians, and independent researchers who've uncovered an incredible amount of research of source material. Sorry, on slavery, and they've publicized those findings, oftentimes in the most radically democratic way possible, on things like blogs that everybody can access, and have really put this conversation in the public sphere for the first time. And it forces all of us, including people like me who study this topic, to acknowledge the region's history of and connection to slavery. And so you have these four conversations going on, and you have many different people over the past generation or so talking to each other and with each other, and often past each other, about the history of slavery in New England, of the memory of that history, and the politics of that memory. So in the book, what I try to do is bring together these conversations and use them to narrate a new, more comprehensive, yet accessible history of New England slavery. So in short, I stand on the shoulders of people who've been in the trenches doing this work for the past 25 years. In that sense, I view the book as not only as an end, right? It synthesizes 25 years of scholarship to more fully tell this history of slavery in New England. But I also see it as a beginning. It provides a set of facts, a framework, and a starting point for future conversations. So how do I narrate this conversation and all this work that these different parties have been doing? As the title implies, Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds, I wanted to be as comprehensive as possible. I discussed the lives of enslaved Africans and Indigenous people in New England, how their enslavement was instrumental to the colonization of the region, and how slavery and colonization were two processes designed to transform New England into a place that best served the region's white settler population, especially its wealthiest colonists. All three of those are tall orders in and of themselves, but my press told me I had 60,000 words to do this. That's about 175 pages in print, depending on the layout. So not a whole lot of space, and to make it approachable, not only for other scholars, but also for the reading public. This was no small task. Keep it short and readable. Indeed, the hardest part of writing the book was not what to research and write. I had 25 years of incredible source material, right, from academics, researchers, and activists, but rather how. How do you create a book that is short yet comprehensive, comprehensive yet readable, readable yet sensitive to the subject matter? And now the book's published. I really hope I pulled it off. And it's been out for about a little over a year now. So I really hope I pulled this off. But that was the real challenge, was how do you write a book that tackles all of these things while while addressing the reading public? The book is both a chronological and topical narrative that opens with the colonization of New England in the 1620s and 30s and ends in the early 19th century by examining the process of emancipation. To provide some coherence, the book uses one organizing theme, and that theme is connections. The connection between New England slavery and slave societies in other parts of the Americas, the connection of slavery in New England to the larger social, economic, and cultural and political development of the region, and how those two types of connections, so the connection of New England slavery to other slaveries, and the connection of slavery in New England to the development of the region, how those two connections shaped the lives of enslaved people, and how enslaved people shaped those connections in turn. So really focusing on the lives of enslaved people through this lens of connection. The book opens by examining the connection between slavery and colonization. So the first chapter looks at when the settlers arrive, the English settlers arrive. If anyone's familiar with the history of slavery in New England, you know there's a sort of mythical starting date, and one in which scholars used for a very long time. And that starting date was 1638. In that year, a ship called the Desire sails into Boston Harbor. It's a New England ship. I believe it was built in Salem, but it left Boston earlier in 1638, and it traveled to the West Indies, to the Caribbean, on a trading voyage. And when it came back, John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts, recorded what it brought back from the West Indies. And it brought back some tobacco, some cotton, some salt, but also enslaved Africans. We don't know how many, but it just lists, John, in his list of things it brought back, John Winthrop lists Negroes, which is the term, the 17th and 18th century term for enslaved people. So that was oftentimes for historians the sort of, this is the aha moment. This is when slavery began in New England. The problem is that has come really under scrutiny in the past about decade. And for two reasons. The first is we actually know there were enslaved people in New England not long, because settlers are long, but before before 1638, there were enslaved Africans. So, for example, we have accounts of fishing settlements in Maine in the late 1620s and early 1630s, in which there were enslaved Africans working there. We have accounts of the Boston Harbor travel logs that discuss the presence of enslaved Africans in the mid 1630s, before the Desire's voyage. But the other and kind of more significant piece of that, of kind of reconsidering the Desire, is that scholars actually started studying the Desire's entire voyage, not just its return, but also its departure. And one of the things they found is in the Desire's hold, when it departed Boston, were a number of Pequot captives, Pequot Indians from what's today Connecticut, because between 1636 and 1638, the New England colonies went to war with the Pequot people, and the war resulted in the capture of hundreds of men, women, and Pequot men, women, and children, many of whom were then sold out of the colony. And so now this creates a kind of different situation, a kind of a different way of thinking about the origins of New England slavery, because it's not just about the importation of enslaved Africans. It's about the enslavement of indigenous people and the importation of enslaved Africans. What it also means is that we have to rethink the purpose of slavery in New England. Oftentimes when we think about slavery, we think about it as primarily a labor system, right? That where you enslave people to put them to work. That's not the case, not only the case, I guess, it would be the answer. Certainly, indigenous people in New England were enslaved and put to work in the region, in the region's household. John Winthrop owned a number of enslaved Pequots, for example. But there's other reasons for it. And one of those reasons was to remove indigenous people from their land, to open it up to English settlement. So one of the things that we have to confront is that enslavement of indigenous people was also about sort of removing them. What better way to seize land from indigenous people than to remove those people entirely? So that if they're sold away, they have no claim to the land in which they've been removed from. So this is a key strategy in the removal of indigenous people. But what it also does is selling those captives out to the West Indies gives New Englanders the option, a trade good that's people in this case, that's valuable enough to exchange for enslaved Africans. And both of these processes, the removal of indigenous people from their lands and the importation of enslaved Africans, allows for the rapid expansion of the New England colonies. By the end of the 1630s, there's English colonists in pretty much the entire region of New England today, save Vermont, and settlements there. And part of what's allowing this to happen is that they're seizing indigenous people, removing them from their land, and then settling it. Now, of course, this creates labor shortages especially in the seaports and the earlier settlements. And so how do you supplement labor? You bring in enslaved Africans. And so it creates this cycle of exchanging indigenous captives for African captives. And that kind of characterizes slavery in the early 17th century, or at the time of settlement. It's going to change over time, but this is the kind of origins of slavery in New England. Capturing indigenous people, exchanging them for Africans, both of which facilitate the rapid expansion and colonization of New England as a region. Central to this cycle of captive trading was New England's connections to the growing plantation economies of the West Indies. Why did the desire go to the West Indies? Why do they sell enslaved indigenous peoples to the West Indies? Well, they do that because of what's happening there in the Caribbean, especially on the island. It starts on the island of Barbados, a tiny little island in the Eastern Caribbean, but will eventually expand to Jamaica and the Leeward Islands and across the entire region. So what's happening in the West Indies? It's settled about the same time as New England in the 1620s and 30s, Barbados being one of the earliest permanent English colonies. Very quickly, the colonists realized that they can grow sugarcane there. Sugarcane is one of the most valuable commodities of the 17th century. It's considered a luxury good, so it's very valuable. And so they figure out that these islands are perfect for growing sugar. So what they begin to do is they begin a process of essentially terraforming. They strip the islands they cut down all the forest, they clear all the land, and they plant sugarcane. To grow that sugarcane, they increasingly rely on, and by 1650 are totally reliant upon the work of enslaved Africans. And so thousands upon thousands of enslaved Africans are brought from the west coast of Africa and put to work on the sugar plantations of the West Indies. Now there's a problem, however. You've completely terraformed an island and you've imported tons of people. You can't eat sugarcane. So you don't have any wood to build with. You don't have any pasture land for cattle. So you need access to food, to timber, to livestock. Who has that? The New England colonies. The New England colonies, of course, struggled at first. Many of you are probably familiar with this story. Economically struggled because they can't grow valuable cash crops in New England. Tobacco doesn't grow particularly well, except for in the Connecticut River Valley and parts of Rhode Island. Sugarcane doesn't grow at all. And so what they do have, however, is timber and fish. And those are actually highly valued commodities in the West Indies, right? The saltfish can feed enslaved people. The timber is needed for building. There's vast pasture lands in New England, so cattle and sheep and pigs and all of that can be shipped to the West Indies, and that's exactly what happens. By the end of the 1630s, New England is a key provider of food and lumber and livestock for the West Indies. And this is going to create, and what they're doing is they're exchanging those goods, which are not individually that valuable. They're exchanging them for sugar, molasses, things that are significantly valuable, that it then allows New Englanders to trade in London and other parts of Europe and to obtain luxury goods that they otherwise wouldn't be able to. So this is a lucrative trade, and it will remain a lucrative trade up through the end of the Revolution, into the 19th century, in fact, this trade with the Caribbean. And it creates, in this moment, a symbiotic relationship between New England and the West Indies. And it's not just an economic relationship. That's certainly how it begins, the exchange of all of these agricultural commodities for sugar and molasses and some slaves. But also, it's beyond that. It is cultural. It's social. It's political. So we know there's extensive intermarriage between New England merchants, especially in Boston and other seaports, with the planter class of the West Indies and Barbados and other places. There's extensive intermovement between the two regions. Some of the earliest graduates of Harvard were the sons of West Indian planters. And so there's this exchange and relationship between the two regions that becomes central to the economy of New England, and it becomes central to understanding slavery in New England. Because when they're working with slave societies, Barbados, these places, they're by the 1650s and 60s, they're majority African. By 1700, the vast majority of the people who live in a place like Barbados are of African descent and are enslaved. And so New Englanders borrow heavily for their own systems of slavery. So Massachusetts, for example, borrowed slave laws and customs governing slavery directly from Barbados. Most enslaved people who arrive in New England actually had actually spent time in the Caribbean before arriving there. So that's this relationship, this symbiotic relationship between New England and the West Indies is central to economic development, but also central to the creation of slavery. So using this kind of Caribbean connection as a starting point, that's the kind of first chapter of the book, I then move into exploring the way in which enslaved people arrived in New England. All told, about 20,000 enslaved Africans and a smaller number of enslaved Indigenous peoples arrived between the 1630s and 1775. Enslaved people will come to comprise about 4% of New England's population. Now, it's important to stop and dwell on this number, the 4% number, for a minute. This has oftentimes been used as a way for historians and others to write off the relative unimportance of slavery in New England. Oh, it doesn't matter. They were only 4% of the population. It doesn't matter. But we have to think about this in a couple of ways. The first is that is the region as a whole. And what you see when you look at specific areas, the enslaved population rises dramatically in New England. So you take a look at the major seaport, Boston. In the 18th century, Boston's about 12 to 15% of its population is enslaved. It's home to about 10% of the entire enslaved population in the region. Newport, Rhode Island, about 25% enslaved. But it's not just the urban areas. If you take a look at some of the towns in the Connecticut River Valley, Deerfield is a good example of this. Deerfield, Massachusetts in 1750 has a population of about 600 people. Over 50 of them, about 52 or so, are enslaved. So 1 in 8 people in this little, farming community in the Connecticut River Valley are enslaved. You take a look at southwestern Rhode Island, southeastern Connecticut, what's called the Narragansett country, these rich grasslands and farmlands. You have large-scale slaveholdings there, sometimes 30, 40 enslaved people working on what are effectively cattle ranches, dairy operations, horse ranches, that sort of thing. So when you start to look at specific areas, all of a sudden that 4% number is much larger. So that's the first thing, is in particular areas, slavery is really important, as important as other parts of the Americas that we sometimes think about slavery being important, like Virginia or South Carolina or something. But the other piece of this is that connection to the Caribbean. Even if there's not that many enslaved people in New England as a whole, a significant portion of the region's economy is tied to slavery. Especially slavery in the Caribbean. One historian, and I wish I would have thought about this for my own book, has said recently, Boston, using Boston as the example, Boston was a slave society where most of the enslaved people lived elsewhere. Because it's so important, a place like Boston, for providing and provisioning the slave societies of the Caribbean, that it is in effect part of that system. Even if there's not a lot of enslaved people living there in that particular place, in New England, say in Boston, it's still the cornerstone of the economy. What one historian calls the business of slavery is the absolute kind of central piece of New England's economy. So the other piece of this to deal with, if we're talking about population stuff, is that white New Englanders eagerly embraced slave trading as a form of commerce. And Rhode Island became the center of slave trading, not just in New England, but all of British North America. More slave trading voyages leave Rhode Island in the 18th century than all the other colonies that became the United States combined. So a significant number of slave trading is occurring in New England, but especially Rhode Island. And so once again, if we're thinking about the relative importance of slavery, sure, 4% as a region as a whole, but the slave trade is based out of New England, the North American slave trade. Most important for this chapter on enslaved people and the slave trade into New England is I dedicate the bulk of it to exploring the lives of 5 individuals trafficked into New England and their stories and experiences of arriving and being enslaved in the region. One of the stories I tell is the story of Mark, and I'm going to read this briefly for you. Standing on the gallows in the town common of Cambridge, Massachusetts in September 1755, Mark, a quote, Negro man who belonged to the late Captain John Codman of Charlestown, delivered a speech to the large crowd awaiting his execution. Sentenced to hang and have his body put on display for poisoning his master, Mark not only confessed to his crime and offered repentance, but also provided a short biography of his life before the murder. According to the confession, Mark was born into slavery in Barbados sometime in the year 1725. He was sold away from the island as a young boy, probably around the age of 8, when he could be put to work to a succession of masters. One, a brass worker named Mr. Salter, was especially kind to Mark, having, quote, learned him to read and, quote, educated him as tenderly as one of his own children. Salter must not have been that nice, however, as he then sold the enslaved boy to another master, who in turn sold him to John Codman. He put Mark to work in the foundry on his property. Mark then toiled as a metal worker in Boston and Charlestown until he finally grew tired of Codman's abuse and murdered him. Mark's story helps to illustrate an important trend in New England slavery. It is easy to overlook when discussing either the transshipment or the transatlantic slave trade. That is, that many of the slaves who arrived in New England were born in the Americas, namely the West Indies. And so when we dig into these individual stories of people who are trafficked, like Mark, we can see there's a diversity of origins, a diversity of people who arrived enslaved in the region. And so it's really important, you know, when you say enslaved African, that has to be, in itself, has to be kind of contextualized. Well, were they born in the West Indies like Mark? What part of Africa were they from? Have they spent time in the Caribbean after coming from Africa? These are really important questions to kind of to think about. And we see the diversity of peoples that arrived enslaved in New England. From there, the book has 3 chapters exploring the institution of slavery in New England and the lives of enslaved people in the region. These chapters look at topics like slave law, slave labor. By 1720 or so, you're finding enslaved people working everywhere, in every industry across New England. So in tiny towns and on farms in tiny towns, in every industry in the major seaports, distilling, rope making, shipbuilding, all of these used enslaved labor. Enslaved people were sailors. About 25% of the men who lived in the kind of what I would say greater Boston, kind of eastern Massachusetts, about 25% of the enslaved men were sailors. So they can be found in every part of the economy doing all sorts of work, men, women, children, all of them across the region. He also were able to examine the lived experiences of slavery and how enslaved people resisted their enslavement. One of the really unique things about slavery in New England is that the records are unusually rich, the primary source material that we can draw from. So using court records, account books, letters and diaries, wills and probate inventories, and print sources such as newspapers and books, we can get a pretty good sense of what life was like for enslaved people. This makes it unique in the English-speaking world. Most of the time that sources that relate to slavery tend to be the sources of like business sources, so account books of plantations, that sort of thing. Maybe some wills and probates. So in places like Virginia, South Carolina, those sorts of places, you don't always get a lot of rich sources about the lives of enslaved people themselves. Maybe a reference in a letter, maybe an overseer's report, maybe recording, you know, the birth of a child or something. But this is all largely related to the business of the plantation. In New England, however, you have a really rich documentary record that comes out of court records, that comes out of various private records like letters and diaries and things. And so we can actually get to know enslaved people and what their lives were like, who their friends were, who their families were, their husbands, their wives, their children. You can actually really get to know them in a way in New England that you can't in other places. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's so important to study slavery in New England, is especially when we're talking about the United States as a whole or the Atlantic world as a whole, is that this is a place where we can actually hear the voices of enslaved people and really understand their lived experiences. The final chapter of the book explores the American Revolution and its impact on slavery. The Revolution, in many ways, provided the impetus for ending slavery in New England, and for both ideological and economic reasons. More significantly, the kind of chaos of the Revolution, of overthrowing one government and installing a new one, it created opportunities for enslaved people to strike out for their own freedom through activism, military service, or simply running away. That opportunity then to get out of slavery in various ways opened up a world of possibilities. One of the most amazing statistics I found, it just blew my mind when I came across it, is that if you take a look at the 1790 federal census, the first census conducted by the United States government in 1790 for Connecticut, it broke down by householder. So who was the head of the household? That's the only real name you get. But it did denote the race of the householder. So it did denote who was of African descent. So if you look at the state of Connecticut in 1790, 20% of the African American, of the black men who were heads of household, 20% of them were veterans had fought in the Continental Army and could trace their freedom to their service in that army. So this is a significant number of people take advantage of the opportunities of the Revolution. Others joined the British and found their freedom that way. I found the story of a man named Pompey Fleet, who belonged to a Boston printer named Thomas Fleet Jr., and Fleet escaped to the British. And he worked for a printer, first in New York City, which was the headquarters of the British Army. And then he ended up in Halifax, Nova Scotia, as a free man working in a print shop. And then in 1791, he migrated to the British colony of Sierra Leone in West Africa, a newly established colony, largely for freed blacks, especially black loyalists from the American Revolution and other black people living in London. And he was probably, the circumstantial evidence suggests, the first printer there. And so we can follow these stories and see the opportunities that the Revolution offered folks. The chapter, for that reason, following people like Pompey Fleet, like these householders in Connecticut, the chapter ends on a cautiously optimistic note. By the mid-1780s, slavery had no legal standing in any of the New England states, in theory. Enslaved people were rapidly becoming free, in theory. The region's slave trade had been abolished, in theory. And there were real possibilities for freed people to become equal members of the new United States, in theory. The epilogue of the book, however, is less optimistic. It examines all of those in theories and puts them in context, demonstrating the ways enslaved and recently freed people were systematically denied freedom, disenfranchised, segregated, and alienated from white New England society. So, for example, one of the things that you can track in the records that I found and I write about in the book is this process called selling out. All told, between about 1760 and 1790, over 1,000 people of African descent, some enslaved, some freed, some who had been freed and kidnapped, were sold out of the region. They're sold to the West Indies, they're sold to the American South, they're sold to Atlantic Canada. A significant number of them were actually sold to Atlantic Canada. Essentially, a lot of enslavers see the writing on the wall. They know that slavery is going to come to an end, either legally or economic. It's not as profitable. But enslaved people themselves are still worth money, especially in places where slavery was legal and was still profitable. And so they began selling these enslaved people out. It's to the point that all of the New England states in the 1780s had to pass laws to prohibit it. That doesn't stop it. And so there's this process of selling enslaved people out. And on top of that, you have these kind of lost promises of freedom. The moment that large numbers of enslaved people in New England begin to get free, you see the rise of racial segregation. So public schools are segregated in New England in the 1790s. You see the marginalization from the labor force. Enslaved people in New England were really skilled. Many of them work in urban trades as blacksmiths and carpenters and coopers and things like that. And all of a sudden, the moment they become free, they find themselves locked out of the labor force for racist reasons. So they can't find jobs. They're legally segregated. And so many free people just leave New England. Many of them settle in upstate New York. Some of them settle in the Midwest. Some of them just kind of drift around the region. But many of them leave the region as a whole. So between selling out and this kind of exodus of people looking for opportunities elsewhere, you see the sort of population, the freed population actually declines. And the Black population of New England will not rise again, will not grow again until you begin to see a large number of migrants from the West Indies and runaway slaves from the American South and freed people, freed Blacks from the South moving northward in the 18 teens and 20s and up through the Civil War. So as this process is happening, as there is the implementation of legal segregation, as Black people are marginalized from the economy, as others are kidnapped and sold away, what about those white worlds, right? That's part of the book is Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds. What about those white worlds? What's going on? Well, let me read that for you. As Blacks left the region or struggled to eke out a living, New England's white population never faced the consequences for the sins of slavery. Rather, they enjoyed all the benefits of generations of slave ownership with little regard for those who suffered under its yoke. Even sympathetic whites or enslavers who realized the errors of their ways benefited. As I talk about this in other parts of the book, poorer whites, many who had never owned slaves, embraced racism and the marginalization of people of color. Not only did that lessen competition in the job market, but it gave poor whites the psychological satisfaction of racial superiority. As slavery dwindled in New England, many whites, including those who had owned slaves, began to define themselves as fundamentally different from other Americans, especially those in the South. New England was, quote, free soil, so rich in liberty that slavery could never take deep root. Slavery, this line of thought went, was never important to the New England economy, was only practiced by a few wealthy families, and was a largely benevolent institution. Most importantly, white New Englanders realized the errors of their ways during the American Revolution and abolished slavery forever. These are probably all stories you've heard. In crafting this narrative of a free New England, whites absolved themselves of the sins of slavery. Such a belief system allowed for whites to shift blame for Black poverty and immiseration away from the legacies of slavery and onto individual moral failings. Under this logic, if people could not thrive in a land of liberty and opportunity, they had no one to blame but themselves. White New Englanders, in short, made slavery and its legacies history. And it's that facet that reverberates across time and where I'm going to end this afternoon/morning. The ability of white New Englanders to totally distance themselves from slavery helped craft many of the myths about slavery in New England. That slavery was economically unimportant. Only a few people were enslaved, and slavery never really took root here. Morally superior New Englanders saw the error of their ways and quickly abolished slavery. Or perhaps worst of all, slavery never existed in New England, or at least not in a form that most Americans would recognize as such. And my hope is, at the very least, that this book is able to confront and help fight these myths. Thank you all so much. I'm happy to answer your questions about my book.
Thank you very much, Jared. Am I on here now?
You are on.
All right. I have a few questions, and perhaps others will come along. One has to do with the term Winthrop's use of the term Negro to mean an enslaved person. And the question is, given that Indigenous people were also enslaved, can you say more about the use of that term?
Yeah, so when New Englanders, they will call Indigenous people Indians. So that's the common term for Indigenous people. So when they talk about enslaved Indigenous people, they would say that enslaved Indians. That's the terminology they use. The term Negro actually also comes from the Spanish negro or black. One of the things, and this is both the case for Indian and Negro, these are terms borrowed from Spanish. and Portuguese. One of the things we oftentimes, when we think about the settlement of what became the United States by the colonization of what became the United States, and we think about slavery, we want to think about them as largely sort of domestic or kind of locally created things. Like these are, kind of created out of thin air for a variety of reasons, that the English people needed to establish slavery because of labor shortages, and they needed more work to grow sugar and tobacco or whatever. But the thing is, the English people, before they even arrived in New England, were readily familiar with slavery. In the 16th century, before the before the English people began colonizing the region, colonizing anywhere in the Americas, in fact, there was extensive travels of English people all around the world, literally across the globe. And everywhere they traveled, they would encounter slavery. And one of the places they encountered slavery most frequently was in the West Indies and in the Caribbean, which had been colonized by the Spanish. And so it's not, they confront labor shortages and they decide to use enslaved labor. It's actually the other way around. They understand slavery. They understand you can enslave indigenous people. They understand you can enslave people of African descent readily, and that can help address your problems. And so a lot of the terminology around slavery, Negro, Indian, that's all actually borrowed right from the Spanish. And in fact, some of the laws and things are also borrowed right from the Spanish, from this encounter with it before the English people even colonized.
I have a couple of questions, basically converging on the question of what happened to the enslaved Native Americans after they were taken, they were enslaved and sent to the West Indies. It's not just the West Indies. At first, it's just the West Indies, but it's a process that continues throughout the 17th century, and it actually only increases over time. So there's a few hundred Pequots sold out at the end of King Philip's War. There's upwards of 2,000 indigenous people sold out, and then there's indigenous people sold out in between that time. So there's large numbers of indigenous people sold out in the 17th century, and like I said, at first it's the West Indies. So the desire, for example, went to this island called Providence Island, which is off the coast of modern-day Honduras. I think it's today a territory of Colombia. And Providence Island was settled by Puritans at the same time New England was. And so this is one of the ways in which they become involved in the West Indies, as they're trading with Providence Island. And so the settlers on Providence Island are growing tobacco using largely enslaved African labor. By 1640, the colony actually has a majority enslaved population. So that's one way. That's how they're exchanging. So Providence Island, but after Providence Island's recaptured by the Spanish in 1641, but after that, they're trading with Barbados, Jamaica, Bermuda receives enslaved people. There's still a community in Bermuda today that are descendants of Wampanoag people, or Narragansett people, I'm sorry. And so they're there, but they're also sold to the Azores, to Tangier in North Africa. There's even circumstantial evidence that enslaved indigenous New Englanders end up in Madagascar. So they're kind of sold all over. And it's so many, especially in the aftermath of King Philip's War in 1676. In the aftermath of King Philip's War, so many indigenous people are being sold out of New England, captives from the war, that both Barbados and Jamaica passed laws prohibiting the further importation of indigenous slaves from New England. So they prohibit that. And you answered the next question. The next question was, were the Pequots the only people who were enslaved? And of course, you mentioned the Narragansett and Wampanoag, and there were
so pretty much all the groups are subject to it at different times. It usually, and of course, because King Philip's War is like a pan-Indian alliance against the colonists, it was all of those groups are captured and sold into slavery. The other thing is we also have to confront just how insidious of a practice this was. It's not just a consequence of conflict, right? That, we captured a bunch of people in conflict, so now we can sell them away. There's deliberate attempts of this. There's a letter from 1645 from a man named Emmanuel Downing, who was John Winthrop's brother-in-law and a magistrate and settler in Salem. And he actually writes a letter. Chapter 1 opens with this letter asking, essentially telling Winthrop that we should start a war with the Narragansett, because then we can sell those captives and obtain African slaves. So this is something that's very much in their mind. It's very deliberate. They understand exactly what they're doing when this isn't just a consequence of conflict. It's rather it's a deliberate thought process in which they're following.
Okay. Here's a question. Whether I mean, this is maybe outside the scope of your research, but asking if you have any information on why Africa was where enslaved people were traded from as opposed to other parts of the world.
It's a really long history. There's a huge literature on this. It has to do with the nature of European contact with Africa in the 15th century. We're going back to medieval times. So when the Portuguese begin exploring outside of Europe, they travel the west coast of Africa. They're trying to get to India, right? They're trying to find a route to the spices and silks of Asia. But they get stalled on the west coast of Africa, partly because Africa is such a big continent and their sailing ships are not particularly durable enough to get, to make this journey. They have to learn the geography and the currents and all that. But they find gold in West Africa. And especially in what's today Ghana, which was then called the Gold Coast, they find huge deposit that these areas are rich in gold. Much of that gold is actually before this moment is being shipped across the Sahara into the Middle East, to the Islamic world. And of course, Portuguese want access to that. And African societies use slave labor. It's very different than what we think of as slavery, kind of plantation slavery. It's largely kind of household-based slavery. But to mine gold, especially, they needed enslaved laborers. So one of the things the Portuguese do is they get involved in the inter-African slave trade. So they would buy enslaved people from one part of Africa and sell them to another part for gold, as a way of obtaining gold from Africans. And what this does is, over time, it normalizes the idea, two things. It normalizes a slave trade, trafficking human beings, but it also normalizes the fact that people of African descent can be enslaved and are enslavable. You add it to the fact that most of them they're not Christian. That only furthers the sort of enslavability of people of African descent. And then to that are added over time a lot of the kind of racist ideas around people of African descent that are kind of added over time that further justify that. So it kicks off a process that moves over time. So much so that by the time the English arrive in the Americas, by the time New England's being colonized in the 1620s and 30s, it is axiomatic. It's just automatic that most English people, Europeans, associate slavery with people of African descent.
On a related topic, I guess you could say, here's a question. Did you share your manuscript with researchers of African American descent before you published?
Yeah, I have a couple of the readers. One of the peer reviewers was African American. I have a number of colleagues read parts of it. I draw from the scholarship of African Americans. So, plenty of, had read the book before it went to publication.
Thank you. Here's another. How necessary were enslaved farm workers and domestic servants for upper-class New England professionals such as ministers, lawyers, and doctors to pursue their professions?
It can be really helpful. It will just depend. Of course, it depends situation to situation. One of the interesting things, there's a couple of things I found. Wealthy New England, especially wealthy merchants who in the 1720s and 30s, they began buying up plots of land, especially kind of in greater Boston and places like I just forgot the town. In places like Dorchester, Milton, once you get outside of Boston a little bit, they're decent. It's decent enough farmland. Wealthy merchants who spend most of their time in Boston are buying up land, and they're putting enslaved laborers to work on it, to work that land. It's a way of making extra money. It's a way of keeping the land productive. Things like that. The other, but for, say, professionals like ministers, a lot of ministers own enslaved people. Now, sometimes that's for haphazard reasons, right? So Cotton Mather owned an enslaved people, because they were gifts from his congregation. So the congregation offered him a slave. So his enslaved man named Onesimus was a gift from his congregation. Other owners, however, deliberately purchase enslaved people, especially in rural towns. Ministers might be the only slaveholder because they own an enslaved person or two who are working the lands that are given to them as part of their the glebe lands, as they're called, that are attached to the parish. But of course, the minister doesn't have time to work them, and he'd have to pay people if he wanted that land worked otherwise. So using slave labor actually made sense. And so one of the things that for the wealthy, slavery saves them time, right? It frees up time in other areas. So you can put them to work in a field so you don't have to do the work in the field. So professionals do tend to own slaves for two reasons. One is kind of supplemental labor, that sort of thing. But also for wealthy people, especially, it is about the ownership. It's to show their wealth, right? Through the ownership of other people as a way of demonstrating their wealth.
His question, what were housing conditions like for enslaved people in New England?
Cramped would be the one word for it. So most slave holdings are fairly small in New England. Most people who own enslaved people own one or two. And so they live in the house oftentimes, and if they live in the house, that meant they were squeezed into an attic, into a loft. That's kind of where they resided, maybe a cellar, which would not have been pleasant. If there's a little more land, sometimes enslaved people might live in the outbuilding, in an outbuilding while the family lives in the home. So it's not like the South where there's extensive slave quarters. They're oftentimes kind of any kind of nook and cranny in the house is where they would live. If any of you have been to Medford, the Royal House there is unique in the fact that it had a detached slave quarters. But oftentimes, like even in the mansion houses, though, enslaved people would be put in the storage rooms above the kitchen or above the chimney or near the chimney or whatnot in the central part of the house. So very cramped, oftentimes kind of extra space in the house or whatnot.
A question, during the American Revolution, were enslaved men sent to serve in the Continental Army in the slaveholder's place, and how frequently did that happen?
That would happen, but as part of that, they would have to sign over their rights. They essentially have to sign their manumission papers if they did that. But yeah, that did happen. They would, put an enslaved person in their stead. There's a fairly extensive record of this at the state archives in Massachusetts, where they would be these kind of the way they're kind of enslaved people are drafted in lieu of, but also because of, but also they just were drafted generally. But they, as part of that, they were given their freedom. And so for, for enslavers who want to send their slave off to war, they're going to have to sign over their freedom. Now they do. Now the enslaver will collect the bounty, and I think a certain percentage of the wages for a while, but they also have to sign over their freedom. So this is it's kind of a give and take.
Thank you. Let's do two more. What did you find surprising during the research and preparation that you did for your book?
Both for the first book and for this book, I'm still oftentimes surprised by the way that some documents allow us to really understand the lives of enslaved people, people who were, although more literate in New England than other regions, but who were largely illiterate, who were marginalized, who were abused, all of that. The way in which various court records that contain their testimonies and their depositions, and you learn about their everyday lives. You learn about their relationships with their children. You learn about their spouses, their friends, who they associate with. I'm still, just really surprised by our ability to understand day-to-day lives of enslaved people in a way that's unheard of in the English-speaking world. If you look at Virginia, South Carolina, Barbados, you can't do that, or there's only really few exceptional sources that allow you to do that. But in New England, it's not exceptional. You can do that with hundreds of enslaved people. You can kind of figure out these sorts of day-to-day details of their lives, and that's what I still am shocked by, and I'm still so fascinated by.
Okay, one more. What are some good ways for amateurs, independent scholars, to research slave ownership in a particular town or slave ownership in white New England family tree?
Yeah. So the best way is that Family Search. I don't know if any of you have heard of Family Search or not, but Family Search is part of Ancestry.com, but it's all free, and it's owned by the Church of Latter-day Saints. And in the 1970s, from the 1940s to the 1970s and 80s, really, the Church of Latter-day Saints digitized, or I'm sorry, microfilmed tons of public records, court records, probate records, things like that. They've now digitized that microfilm and put it all online. So we actually, all these court records and probate records I've referenced in my talk, you can actually find those easily on Family Search. I just Googled the county, so Suffolk County, genealogy, and usually it's the Family Search link that first pops up. You create a free account and you have access to these materials. And so for a particular town, you could look for, you'd have to find the county, and then you can look through probate inventories and wills pretty easily. And same thing for individuals is even easier, because you have a name, so you can just look for them in a docket book or an index and find them. That's kind of where I would start. Now, if there's someone of prominence that might have the regular people, that's where I'd start. But if there's someone of prominence who, had a public persona, wrote letters, kept diary, that would also be the place to kind of look and to look at. There's also, in terms of towns, there's a 1771 census. Tax record that's very well done. It's been digitized, and you can see the number of enslaved people living in individual towns. The problem with tax records and census in the colonial period, though, is they oftentimes undercount, sometimes dramatically undercount enslaved people, because enslaved people were taxable property, so it behooved them to hide them from tax collectors. But that's the sort of place you can look. And then once you have a kind of set of, some basic facts, okay, how many enslaved people are in the town, who owned them, then you can start digging into, say, court records and other types of town records and county records to see if there's even more information available.
Thank you very much. This has been very enlightening, and I thank all of you for joining us today. And I would just remind all of the attendees that there is the link for Black Lives, Native Lands, White Worlds in the chat thread. So copy that link, and keep up the good work. I can't wait to read the book about the slave trader who was also a chocolatier.
Oh yeah, hopefully next year that'll be out. So
all right. Thank you very much. Thank you to the Concord Festival of Authors, and thank you to all of us for all of you rather for being part of this today. Have a good weekend.
Yeah. Thank you all.
Thanks a lot.